Hey everyone, thanks for checking out our next installment of tutorial videos here with Ableton Live, brought to you by Maven. So today we're going to take a look at the new features in Ableton Live 9.5. A little while ago, Ableton released an update to 9.2, and it's compact with a lot of interesting features that have sort of brought Ableton Live into a much different and newer context. So we have a few new features here, and I'm just going to run through a few of the primary features that they've added, including updates to the simpler instrument, updates to the auto filter, as well as a few little aesthetic tweaks such as auto color coordinating with the tracks and the added peak versus RMS levels in the volume meters. So first you can see I have a drum loop here down at the bottom, and one feature that they have added is a much more detailed view of waveforms here in the clip view. And you can see that when I zoom in, we have a much higher detail within the waveform here. You might notice that with the previous versions of Ableton, when you would zoom really far in like this, you would get some sort of jagged shape to the line here. And now we see that we get a nice, evenly curved, smooth recreation of the audio file here. So that's great when you're doing very small micro edits, or you're looking to find the very first part of a sample or the transient here. Great. So we can also see I got a drum loop here, and I'm just going to play that. And another thing that we can see immediately is we have different volume meters here, and we have two different colored meters here. The brighter color here is our RMS level, and RMS refers to the average perceived loudness of the sound, and that darker color is our peak level. So this way it's a much better representation of the overall sound. So when you're mixing, you have a better idea of the perceived loudness, as if a person hearing the music would hear it, and your peak level to make sure that you're not clipping on your master channel over here. The next really large update we have here would be our auto filter. Now, open up auto filter here, we see that the interface has changed quite a bit. And we can see that we have an extra filter mode here at the very end, and that is our morph filter. So Ableton has added the ability, just listen to that real quick, has added the ability to morph between all the different filter shapes with one knob. And you notice that on low pass, we have our typical filter parameters here. And when I switch over to filter morph, we now get a knob here at the bottom that is titled morph. And now you'll notice I'll lower the filter frequency cutoff here and turn morph. So first it morphs into a bandpass filter, and then into a high pass filter, to a notch filter, and then returning to the low pass. Really great way to get some very interesting filter movements, especially in live performance mode or when recording certain automations on tracks. Another addition we're going to notice is now we have the ability to choose our filter slope with our decibels per octave here. So the filter will default at 24 decibels per octave. And when we switch to 12 dB per octave, we notice that we get a much more gradual filter slope. So with these different filter slopes, we have a little more control over how aggressive that filter is going to sound and how steep that cutoff point will be. The next biggest improvement we've gotten with our auto filter is our different modes. So putting this back on a low pass filter, we now have a menu of different filter models. These are all made by a company called Cytomic, and these come from one of their plugins called the Drop, and they're all analog modeled filters here. And if we open up Ableton's info view, and if we hover over this menu, we learn that each one of these filters has some specific characteristics. So clean, of course, matches the filters that are found in the EQ8, as well as the old auto filter. OSR is the state variable circuit, so that has a very hard clip to it. The MS2 is the Sallen-Key circuit, so it's much softer clipping. The SMP is a hybrid between the MS2 and the PRD, and that PRD is the last filter mode here, which is a ladder circuit that doesn't have any resonance limiting. So that means that our resonance, we can increase that to a very high amount and get that whining, high-pitched kind of sound in the background there. You notice that when we switch to these filter modes, we get a parameter, we get a drive parameter. And that's nice, so we can boost the input level into the filter to add distortion to whatever we are filtering. Turn down my master a little bit. That we're getting a lot of additional gain output from the filter, and it does distort the sample a fair amount depending on which filter mode you have. So remember, the OSR has very hard clipping, and the MS2 has a much softer clip to it. There we can hear that unlimited resonance from the PRD there. I'm not going to turn that up too much. But we can see that we can turn the resonance all the way up to a point where we get a sustained note on top of the sample that we are filtering. There you go. Those are the additions to the auto filter. Now, with the updates that came to the auto filter, those updates were also rolled into other instruments such as the operator and sampler and simpler as well. So if you open up an operator patch here and we go into the filter section, we can see that we have access to the morph mode as well as all of the other analog modeled filter modes, which is really great. So when you're making synth sounds, you can accompany that with an analog modeled filter to really add to that sound. The biggest overhaul in the new update definitely comes from Simpler. So loading up Simpler here, we can see that the entire interface has become redesigned. We have a completely new sample viewer here. We also have the addition of our different filter modes down here in the bottom left. And so what I'm going to do here is add this drum loop. I'm going to load this into Simpler. And with the new Simpler, we have the ability to have a breakaway window here. If we hit the little caret up here on the top left, then our sample is then displayed above our instrument and effects chain down here. So it actually separates the control panel from the sample view, which is very useful. That way we can make changes to our filter or our LFO or our envelopes while still being able to view the sample here in the sample viewer. So let's talk about some of the new changes in Simpler that we've gotten. First and foremost, we have these 3 modes. So we have classic mode. So this allows us to trigger a sample using MIDI, either using your computer keyboard as a MIDI controller or some kind of external MIDI controller. And classic mode exhibits the same behavior as the previous versions of Simpler, allowing you to play polyphonic voicings of a sample, so we can play multiple notes at the same time. One of the biggest improvements, however, has come from the addition of warping into Simpler. One issue with the older version of Simpler is when you would add a sample that you wanted to play using some kind of MIDI controller, as you would pitch it up and pitch it down by playing higher and lower MIDI notes, the sample would get shorter or longer. So the higher the pitch you would play, the sample would get shorter and shorter, and the lower the pitch you would play, the longer the sample would get. And Ableton had realized that a lot of people would prefer these samples to remain warped and have the ability to play them all across the keyboard without affecting the length. And so they did just that, and they added their very useful warp algorithms here to the Simpler, allowing us to play samples at different pitches without affecting their length. So here is the original pitch. And now I'll play this sample an octave higher. And now I'll play them both together. So you can hear that the sample has been pitched up, but the length itself has not changed. So that allows us to take other different things like pad sounds, lead sounds, basses, and take a single sample of that synth sound, put it in here, and create an entire instrument that is mapped across an entire keyboard without affecting the length of the sample itself. The next mode we have here is one shot. And this is a monophonic version of the classic mode, where we can play one note at a time. And when you hit your MIDI note, it will play through the entire sample that you have loaded, as long as it is on trigger mode. So within one shot mode, we have 2 different settings. We can be in trigger, where when we trigger the sample, it plays it from beginning to end. And when we have it on gate mode, this allows the sample to only be played while we're holding down the MIDI note. So every time the sample stops, that's when I'm lifting my finger off of the keyboard. We can also adjust fade in and fade out time as well, similar to the attack and the decay time of a sample. So you can increase the fade in as well as the fade out. These are useful, especially the fade in, if you ever want to get rid of any kind of sharp transient to a sound. Next to these fade in and fade out parameters, we also have a transpose knob, as we had with the previous version of Simpler. And again, transposing something is not going to affect the speed at which the sample is being played back, due to the addition of all of our warping capability now in Simpler. Now, the next mode, definitely the most exciting in my opinion, is the slice mode. And when we hit slice mode, we now see that we have the sample in front of us with each individual sound sliced out with these vertical lines that you see here in the sample viewer. Now these lines can be moved around, and what each line corresponds to is a different MIDI note that plays back each sample. So instead of, the old way to do this would be to take a drum loop, put it in the drum rack, which would default opening the sample in Simpler, and then manually making edits and copying that instance of Simpler out to achieve this playability of a drum sample. Now Ableton has allowed us to automatically slice this into multiple pieces, and then they're auto-assigned to keys on a keyboard or a MIDI controller. Now you'll notice that we do have some slices here that don't have a lot of very pertinent information in it. So typically we'd want to have access to our kicks and our snares and at least a couple hi-hats. And so we might not need all of these slices. So they've added a sensitivity feature here that allows us to choose our level of sensitivity when it auto detects the transients within the sample. Because that's basically how this works. It sets a threshold like a gate, and anything over that threshold is given a slice and is given its own key. So you can actually increase or decrease that sensitivity and only have it detect things that are very high volume, which would be your kick drums and your snares. So now you can see that my slices are much larger. And so that way we can sort of remove some of the guesswork of playing, 20, 30 different MIDI notes to try and find which ones have the snares and kicks that we want to use. And this way we can just lower the sensitivity and give ourselves the most important sounds that we want to extract from this drum loop. We can also see that in slice mode, we have trigger and gate as well. So of course, trigger is going to play the entire slice from front to back, and gate is only going to play back the sample for as long as you hold the MIDI, the note. Now, we also have a playback menu here with 3 options where we have mono, poly, and through. Now, mono is going to allow us to just play one slice at a time. So even if I hit 2 keys at the same time, whichever one was hit first will take priority, and only that sample will play back. Now, with poly mode, this allows us to play multiple samples at the same time. So this makes more sense for playing in some actual drum beats here. So that way we can actually layer different sounds and we can perform the drums as if a drummer was playing them, playing hi-hats, kicks, and snares all together at the same time. Next to that, we have the number of voices. So if the sensitivity was very high and we had 32 different slices, we could play up to 32 different voices. Anywhere between 1, which would make it a monophonic version of the simpler, all the way to 32 voices. So that's poly mode. And our next mode is through. Now, through will play the entire audio file through subsequent slices. So if I hit the first one here, so even though I have this audio file sliced up, it is still going to play back through all of the subsequent slices until I hit a new slice. And again, in slice mode, we can adjust our fade in and fade out time, being our attack and decay times. Because as we can see in Classic, we still get our attack, decay, sustain, and release. But with these other modes, where it's breaking them up into these one-shots or slices, we are given a fade in and fade out time, which is essentially the equivalent to an attack and decay time. Now with the warp mode, we still have access to all 6 of our different warp modes here. So we could pick beats. And we could have it focus on a certain subdivision. We could change our looping, transient loop mode here, and the length of our envelope. And then we can also switch the length of the sample here as we can in the clip view. So I could hit multiply by 2. And so now we've doubled the length. So we could put that on transients, get a cleaner warp. Change our loop mode back. Divide it by 2. So it'll still be synced to the tempo. So if I hit play with the metronome on, right, so it's essentially playing it in double time. If I hit times 2, so that's our original tempo. If I hit it again, now it'll be in half time. And so that's going to allow us to take any of these samples and warp them. We can change the playback speed by a factor of 2 to either play them in double or halftime, but still have them be synced to the master tempo within our session. And those are all of the new features with Simpler. So we have the added interface. We have our 3 new modes here. Slice mode, allowing us to automatically slice up samples and assigning them to keys on a keyboard. And we have the addition of our different filter modes, which gives a whole new voice to our samples within Simpler. Turn the drive up a little bit. And lastly, we've had an addition to the color coding here in Live. As you see, if I add new tracks, Ableton now will automatically color these tracks for you. So to create a bit of color variation here within your session here. And of course, we have our peak and RMS. This has been a long needed feature that is very helpful during the mixing process when you're trying to normalize certain things and bring that RMS level a little closer to that peak level to increase that perceived loudness. Well, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed all of these new features of Ableton Live 9.5, and thank you for watching.